All right, so for the second part of the chapter, we're going to be discussing multicultural counseling. And so a little bit of background is that in the early 90s, so about 1991, three researchers, Gerald Wing Su, Patricia Arredondo, and Roderick McDavis, began to write about the need for all counselors to have an understanding of cultural, racial, and ethnic issues. And Gerald Wing Su remains one of the most cited multicultural scholars today. So this really developed in 1991, 1992, where these psychologists believed that counselors, psychologists need to have a minimum understanding of multicultural issues. And they called these competencies and standards. And these competencies had three parts: knowledge, awareness, and skills, which we'll go over in a couple slides. Their idea is that all counseling is multicultural. One can never be neutral because we all have a variety of identities that we bring into the counseling session. So some of the key concepts for multicultural counseling include integrating human diversity within all types of counseling. So that includes when we assess for problems, when we do interventions for treatment. So we're going to include multicultural issues, diversity in every part of the counseling process. For multicultural counseling, we look at the layered complexity of each individual. So we have the client and their layers of complexity. We have the therapist and their own layers of complexity. And we have the interactions between the client and the counselor. Counselors, when they're practicing from a multicultural lens, should examine one's stimulus factor. So what that means is that every person, every counselor has identities that might be impacting therapy. And so this is like the stimulus that the counselor brings to the session. And cultural transference can occur because the client has emotional reactions towards the therapist. And this is based on the client's sense of who the therapist is. So they'll just take a look at you and look at what stimulus you're bringing to the relationship. So maybe they'll look at your skin color, your gender, things like that, and they're going to react. So this is what they sort of term cultural transference as, or the stimulus factor of the counselor. And the client is going to react towards the counselor just based on sort of these factors. And it can happen in reverse too. So the counselor can have a reaction, an emotional reaction based on the client's stimulus factors, so their identities. And this would be cultural countertransference. So those are some main components. Now I want to go into these competencies. So what involves a competent multicultural counselor? The first is that they have to have awareness. They have to have awareness of their own background, their own beliefs, values, biases, and possible blind spots. So this is self-awareness. They need to know about themselves and what they're bringing to the table. They also have to know about other worldviews and backgrounds. So they have to have a sense of knowledge about different cultural groups, about multicultural theories and research, and systems of oppression. There's also skills involved. So a good multicultural counselor should be able to develop strong working relationships with their clients, providing them with a safe environment, have difficult dialogues between the client and counselor, talking about things like gender, race, and so on, and be able to apply appropriate techniques and interventions. So, how does this get applied to counseling? First, multicultural feminist therapists, and now we're going back to just broadly how multicultural feminist therapists work. So, this is not just particular to multicultural therapy, but both of these types of styles break away from the quote unquote expert knowledge that the counselor is an expert and need to teach and the client who doesn't know X, Y, or Z. Instead, they really believe that they need to develop curiosity and openness about others and about their clients. And they call this cultural humility, where they're taking an interpersonal stance that is other oriented. So they're curious about the other person. They are, asking questions and open to the other person rather than doing assumptions or trying to teach the other person. The next application is don't ignore or pretend not to ignore, notice differences. So acknowledge differences and ask about if this is something that should be discussed or um, the client wants to discuss in session. Another application is to remember invisible social identities. So this includes some disability, um, types of disability. It might include religion, which may or may not be invisible, sexual orientation, and others. And to remember that not everyone experiences culture in the same way. So don't assume someone's experience just based on their identity, because everyone will have some variation in this. One specific type of feminist multicultural therapy that the book doesn't really talk about, but I wanted to include, is relational cultural therapy. So this is sort of a blend of feminist multicultural therapy and relational theory, which, remember, sort of comes from psychodynamic perspectives, how the relational components, like object relations. Um, so this theory sort of has a main tenet that it is our connection to others, our relationships to others, that make us grow. And when we feel disconnected or have this chronic disconnection from oneself and from others, this leads to suffering. So, this type of theory really pays attention to this idea of relationships and culture. So, they're going to pay attention to how marginalization might contribute to experiences of disconnection, isolation. This could be racism, class prejudice, sexism, and really pay attention to how these experiences lead someone to disconnect from their self and others. So, this is one theory that is in the realm of feminist multicultural therapy, and Judith V. Jordan is one of the main theorists who developed this theory. To wrap up this section, just note that since multicultural psychology has developed, APA has come out with different practice guidelines to help psychologists gain the knowledge about working with a variety of people. So they've developed these guidelines for a variety of different groups, including girls and women, boys and men, ethnic, linguistic, and culturally diverse populations, lesbian and gay, bisexual clients, older adults, transgender and gender nonconforming people, persons with disabilities, and so on. And so this is supposed to help psychologists read these and learn how to what are the best practices working with these groups. They've also developed guidelines in how to train psychologists in this multicultural counseling, multicultural psychology, and they have a variety of best practices for training and education as well. So this wraps up this chapter on feminist and multicultural psychology. I hope that that's been informative, and please let me know if you have any questions.